Good day, class. Let's now continue our discussion with Unit 3, Formulating a Research Problem, with our third lesson, Setting the Scope and Limitation of a Qualitative Research. With this discussion, we are going to talk about very important concepts in terms of conducting a qualitative research. So make sure to jot down important discussions and to take note of the questions that may possibly arise during the course of this discussion. All right, let us now begin our discussion or our lecture with Lesson 3, Setting the Scope and Limitation of a Qualitative Research. To start off, let us think about this context. Why do you think are the purposes, or what do you think are the purposes of building a fence around a house? Ngano kailangan na may koral ang usa ka balay? Or kung wala may physical nga koral, aduna may sukod kung asa lang taman ang imuhang lote or ang imuhang balay. Why is it important? And what do you think is its purpose? So in this lesson, that's what we are trying to determine. Why is there a scope of conducting a qualitative research study? For this lesson, our objective is to indicate the scope, limitations, and delimitations of the study. Let's take, for example, this scenario, the everyday experiences of local farmers in Nueva Ecija. In this context, or in this research problem, or with this topic, we need to identify the following: a general purpose for conducting the study, the sample population or people who are the subjects of the study, and the possible duration of the study. We also need to define the coverage of the study and avoid or minimize difficulties during the conduct of research. Boundaries or restrictions that can affect the flow of conducting the research study. Now, what is the importance of setting the scope, limitations, and delimitations of a particular study? Let's first try to decode what are these three. First, we have scope. Scope describes the coverage of the study, indicates general boundaries of the study, and serves as the basis when setting up the delimitations of the study. Meaning to say, kung muhisgot tag scope ug sa Binisaya pa, diha rataman or asa taman ang imuhang studyohan. Asa rakutob ang imuhang study about a particular topic or about a particular concept. Setting up your limitations. Now, consider the following: the general purpose of your study, the population involved in the study, and the time element and duration of the study. So all of these elements are going to be considered when we are going to discuss and determine the scope of a particular study. We also need to consider the topics or ideas covered in the study, the geographical details, the theories and methods involved in the studies. Now let's try to understand what is a limitation. Limitation refers to the uncontrollable factors that can affect the process of conducting the study, specifically on the part of the methodology and results. Methodological limitations can include the following: the required number of participants, sufficiency of references to support the claims, the data collected, measurement, and the technique limitations. We also have personal limitations. This include the following: the language barriers, the time constraints, biases, financial or budgetary limitations. Now, when we talk about language barriers, this is now commonly being addressed to because of the different tools or applications or programs that helps us in the translation. Time constraints here means that there are differences in terms of the time, right, in different countries, different areas. The delay in pila ka oras ang delay dito compared sa tuwa. Ang epekto ana sa atuang lawas. Our biases, be it personal, be it political, be it social, be it social, or be it classification according to social status. The financial or budgetary limitations. Are we able to finance the conduct of the study, or are we able to provide for the necessary resources that will be needed for the conduct of this study to travel, to communicate with people, to provide necessary stipends if there are. Now, delimitation class are the boundaries that the researcher sets up based on the identified scope and limitations. Take note that these three are not different from one another, but these three are congruent, meaning to say they influence one another: the scope, the limitations, and the delimitation. This section commonly identifies the following: the specific population, the specific time limit for conducting the research, and the topics and ideas that will be included or excluded. This section commonly identifies the following as well: the specific geographical locations of the observations and the specific theories and methods to be used. Now remember that the scope indicates the general research boundaries, while the limitations are the uncontrolled constraints, while the limitations are controlled and set by the researcher. Now let's try to talk about this in a context. When you talk about population, sa scope, rice farmers in Central Luzon. Klaro, kinsay mong target ng mga participants, asa nga lugar. Sa delimitation, remember, the limitation is controlled and set by the researcher. Ayaw kalibog sa limitations because these are uncontrollable constraints. So sa delimitation class, which is controlled and set by the researcher, in terms of population, we make it more specific. Rice farmers in selected areas in Nueva Ecija, Central Luzon. So mas klaro na karon kung asa lang taman ang discussion nimo. Not only with the scope of rice farmers in Central Luzon, because then again, scope is more generic, general lang gina siya. Kung delimitation karon, you are the one to control it and you are the one to set kung asa rin sila taman. So you are going to specify rice farmers in selected areas in Nueva Ecija, Central Luzon. Another example, time element and duration. For scope, it could be stated there, elections in the post-war period. Post-war period is after World War II, which was during the 1930s, 1920s. So taas na kayo nga panahon, almost 100 years. The delimitation is more specific. Elections in 2004, 2010, and 2016 presidential elections. So mas klaro kung asa nga mga data ang imuhang kwaon, kung unsa nga mga data ang imuhang kinahanglanon, and most of all, kanus-an ni nahitabo, so that you can get or you can generate the data that is more specific. Another example of scope and the difference between scope and delimitation for topics or ideas covered. Scope nimo, occurrence of typhoons. Very general. Delimitation nimo, occurrence and effects of super typhoons. Example was super typhoon Yolanda or Haiyan. So makita na nimo karon the different or the specifications from the general or the broad concept, which is coming from the scope, down to the more specific and controlled set of study that you are going to base it or that you are going to generate information from. For geographical details, the scope, poverty in urban spaces, delimitation. You are going to control and you are going to set the boundaries. Poverty in selected cities and Metro Manila. Urban magyapa na siya. It is still an urban space, but it is now more clearer and more specific. Theories and methods. Scope. Use of qualitative methods instead of quantitative or mixed methods. Delimitation. Use of specific qualitative research methods such as interviews and focus group discussions only. So no need for you to mention instead of quantitative or mixed methods, but there is now an understanding that it will only be specific to qualitative research methods such as interviews and focus group discussions only. Now, with this particular lesson class, I want to wrap up our discussion with these key points. Take note, the scope indicates the general boundaries of the study, while limitations are uncontrollable factors that can affect the conduct of research, while the limitations are the parameters set by the researcher based on the defined scope and limitations of the study. Now, if we are going to illustrate this one, Scope is general. If tulo pa ni siya ka box class, scope is general. While limitation is something that is uncontrollable, constraints. However, the limitations are the one that is you can control and set. Kung asa lang tama ng imuhang studyhan. What's the difference of the two? What's the difference of the three? There is clearly varied differences. However, there is now more focus into the topics or into the data that you are going to base from with your qualitative study. Now, if there are any significant questions or discussions that have arose during this discussion or that are formed during this discussion, make sure to jot them down so that we can cater them during our online discussions. Thank you for watching and keep safe.